Hello, chess players. Mike Amori, WCA. Week 3 update, 4 p.m. class. Game 3 in our journey of looking at some classical master games. This one here is featuring, again, the isolated queen pawn. Also with Anatoly Karpov playing the black pieces, as he did in Game 2. This time he's playing Vasily Smyslov. Both players were world champions. This is played in the USSR Championship in Leningrad in 1971. So I think this is 10 years earlier than the first game. Karpov, again having black, is going to defend the isolated queen pawn, and Smyslov is going to have the white pieces. Okay? So let's move into the game. C4, same opening move as the first game. Very, very flexible. This time, Karpov, instead of playing e6 like he did in game 1, goes for a symmetrical English. So not really important, the names at this point. We're really much more concerned with the structure. But knight f3, knight f6, knight c3. And I'm going to be printing these games out. And I mentioned in the notes that when white plays this way, without attacking any pawns in the center, there's a ton of flexibility for black. Black can play a number of moves here, but I want you to remember or understand why. It's because the white minor pieces are not attacking anything yet. If you go back to the basic king pawn opening, e4, e5, knight f3 is the most common move in this position because it attacks something. It attacks the pawn on e5. If you go back to e4, e5, one way to play for white is to play the Vienna game, which is knight to c3. Perfectly fine. I mean, it can turn into some, you can have some really sharp, crazy positions from this move. But on move 2 for black, you can do plenty of things here because white isn't threatening anything. So if we go back to the position at hand in our feature game, you'll see the same deal when you're playing these kind of flank openings, meaning playing from the side. Black usually has more flexibility. Okay, so game continues with d5 and pawn takes, knight takes, e3, and that's going to prepare the d4 push. Now, the theme in this second week is again the isolated queen pawn. So clearly you know in advance that white is going to be pushing this d pawn. A lot of students in this position, they'll see this game, and e6 was the move that was played. And e6 in these IQPs sometimes, or what's going to become an IQP, is somewhat of a common move. But a lot of people say, hey, why are you locking in this bishop? When it had a clear diagonal, like I could have just pinned on g4. And the reason for that is, if we go back, if you play the pinning move right now, you may get hit with bishop to c4, which turns this into a more tactical kind of position. And then if you play e6 after that, you have to watch out the bishop being shut out of this long diagonal, that you don't get hit with moves like queen a4 check. Can you guys see the issues that black is going to have here? Let me show you something else. If you play bishop to g4 and I play bishop to c4, if you try to alleviate the pressure by playing knight takes c3, you have a really cool move here in this position. And I believe I included this as a diagram in the update in the blog. You have knight e5. That's like a really cool move. You leave your queen hanging two different ways, but you have a mate threat up here. And that's really, really difficult to deal with. If you play e6, the queen just snaps off the bishop, and this knight's looking kind of silly over here. And this is clearly better for white. If you back here try to play, say, bishop to e6, then you can just swap. Just take the bishop, because again, the knight can't take your queen. You're still threatening mate, so they'll take back with the pawn, and now you take the knight, and the structure is just so bad for black. There's absolutely no reason for black to go in for this. So that's why here, after e3, Karpov plays pawn e6, knowing that his light square bishop here will come into the game with an eventual pawn to b6, and that bishop will do quite nicely on this diagonal. Okay, I hope that's clear. All right, so Smyslov, his plan was, after the move e3, was to play d4, and we've talked in all 3 model games so far this term. If your plan is clear in your mind and you play a move that sets up the next move, you look at your opponent's move, which was e6, and ask a very simple question. Do you still believe in your plan? If the answer is yes, then ask, did my opponent's last move affect anything? The answer is no. So then follow through with d4. The only time you guys should change plans is if you realize that your plan is not good. That's called admitting your mistake. Or 2, your opponent plays a move that's stronger than what you want to put into place. Right? That should be clear. There are third reasons, and it's basically time pressure. But, you know, let's be honest, when you're in time pressure, you're not really planning much anyway, are you? There's no time for it. Okay, so clearly d4. We have an exchange, and to keep the game sharp. Interesting, we had the same exact setup in the middle after an exchange on d4 where white can take back 3 different ways. But the sharpest variation is to take with the pawn, which does several things. 1, it opens the diagonal for the dark square bishop. 2, sets up the IQP, which we're really interested in. And then remember, going forward, the use of the e-file. So taking with the pawn is clearly the sharpest way to play. However, my dear friends, it doesn't come without a downside. The pawn is already a target in black's mind. Now, these players are obviously still in opening theory. For our purposes in this class, Ben just pointed at me. Every time I say the word purpose, he thinks I said porpoise, and he'll point at me to remind me of the joke. So every time you hear me in one of these videos say, Ben, now you know what I'm talking about. I'm doing it on purpose. Point. Okay, so the D pawn is a target. The open lines are something white wants. So the battle lines are already formed. Are they an opening theory? Yes. But for our purpose, we're only interested in learning the structure. Okay, black to play, plays bishop to e7. Simple development move, and white continues. Now, at some point, I would recommend stopping the video and try to recall what you learned in class. Do you know what white's next move is? How white sets up their pieces? So, you can always pause. If you're on YouTube, just hit the space bar. So bishop to d3. I mean, that's such a gorgeous square for that bishop. Going after this knight doesn't really make any sense. You could give a check, but I'm not so sure you want to trade light squared bishops. Again, the whole reason for having this IQP is to use the lines that it affords you. You're not interested in trading pieces at this point. You do that only if you have a material advantage. Okay, so let's go with castle. And here, a common question I get from students all the time. They'll say to me things like, well, if this bishop on d3 is so important, why doesn't black just go after it? And it's an excellent question. As a matter of fact, black does go after it, but not in this kind of position, because here the bishop can just tuck itself down to b1, and then at some point, let's say you carry on with your development, play b6, white's going to just tempo the knight, it's going to go back, and black didn't really gain any time, because a3, as you will see, is a useful move anyway. So yes, the bishop got kicked, and it's going to have to spend a tempo coming back. However, the knight did move twice to come in and come out. And keep in mind, there are some times when the bishop will not have to move again because white may make a diagonal battery and threaten mate. But pretty often, you're going to need to get this guy out, especially with this rook hanging out over here on a1. That's not really a great place to be. Okay, that's just a little sample line. If you get hit and you want to keep the bishop, tuck it in, and then kick out the intruder and carry on with your life. Okay, so this did not happen. Karpov does not attack the bishop. He castles. Never forget the color of your uniform. You're black. You know, these are two future world champions, or Smyslov at this point was a world champion. You cannot just go after pieces that you're not going to be able to catch in the opening. So castle, castle, knight c6. Oops, I jumped ahead. Knight c6. And then again, try to remember the standard developing moves for your pieces in the IQP. We've been discussing this. The bishop here on c1, very often you will hear the coaches tell you as you're learning chess, minor pieces first, minor pieces first. And in the vast majority of openings, you will see the bishops come out before the rooks. But here in IQP positions, they tend to get sharper than other openings. So the sharp position demands the most active move that you can play. So if you're just going to randomly bring out the bishop, you know, are you going to put it on e3? I mean, is that what you want to do? Do you even want to offer black a chance to trade and change the nature of the game? Or maybe not. Maybe black might not even take the bishop, but does the move help your position? So rook e1 was played. That is almost always played in this kind of structure. I mean, it's hard to ignore the activity of that rook. Okay, so now comes another mysterious move, knight f6. When you see a grandmaster or a master voluntarily go back with a piece, you have to ask, obviously, why. And here, black voluntarily returns the knight for more than one reason. One, in these IQP positions, your queen on d8 or a rook on d8 is going to pressure the pawn from the front, number one. Number two, in IQP positions, the bishop and the queen and the battery and the knight are all going to line up to attack the king. So for the moment, the knight comes back to f6 and protects a very sensitive square here on h7. There's always that possibility of a bishop sack and then some queen move and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And also here there is a chance for black to play the move knight to b4. And this is a really, really cool idea here. If you are not aware of it, and just play some random move, you might get hit with the move knight b4. This time, if you retreat the bishop, black doesn't really care because you see where this knight can relocate to. It can attack your bishop. You're not going to let me take it, so you're going to move it, and then I can always plant the knight on d5. So now I've managed to take the knight from c6 and move it diagonally. Okay, so that's a pretty cool idea. So white does not like that. So what to do? You can stop your video. Pawn a3. And pawn a3 is not an easy move to play because, as I've already mentioned, this is an IQP position. You want to play as sharply as possible against the black king. Pushing a pawn on the complete opposite side of the board seems counterintuitive, but it's not. It's a useful move to keep the bishop on d3 at its post. Okay? Karpov plays b6. You should know why. And now a nice move. And the more you study these IQP positions, the less mysterious moves begin to make to you. Bishop c2 is played. So it's played with the clear intention of lifting this queen to d3, creating the battery. Could you come to b1 with the same effect? Yes, but you should see that would affect the life of the rook on a1. At our level, you know, if we had a grandmaster giving you this video and not me, and a grandmaster has, you know, 30 years of experience at this level, they're going to be able to tell you more about these moves and ideas. But again, for our reason, we're really learning the basic maneuvering within these structures, the IQP, avoiding trades if you're the attacker, encouraging trades if you have less space. Okay, so bishop c2 is an attacking move. bishop to b7. Notice that Karpov follows our rule. What's his plan? He wants to put his bishop on b7, so he plays b6. That's his next move is bishop to b7 unless white stops it. Now, did bishop c2 stop bishop to b7? No. So you'll see that they follow with the plans. What is white's idea? To put the queen on d3. And you'll see that each player has just enough time to make sure that their opponent's moves are not doing anything harmful. That's how opening theory develops. They follow games and patterns that they already know give them good chances for the middle game, for both sides. If there weren't equal chances for both sides, it wouldn't be opening theory. Now, when I say equal chances, keep in mind that white normally carries an edge even this deep into the opening. And they have one here. You know, if you put this on a modern computer, it's going to give white, you know, probably half a pawn. And that's completely normal. All right, so let's continue on. Rook to c8. Natural placement of the pieces. And here, very interesting moment. And I may have mentioned in the printed notes, when I studied with Grandmaster Lombardi, he always told me that when you have a bishop on, for example, here on c1, that has an open diagonal, please do not think that that piece is not developed. It is developed. It is controlling 5 squares. You know, look at the knights here in the middle. They're controlling lots of squares, but it ain't a whole lot more than 5, right? So this bishop on c1 is a long-range piece, but it is moved now. And you can see how white waits for the right moment to play bishop to g5, because now you have a clear tactical threat of removing the defender and then mating the king. That has to be dealt with, and the move g6 is played. And once g6 is played, white clearly is going to target those dark squares if allowed. Now, they play a rook move here, and the rook move is rook a to d1. Seems a little mysterious again, like you could have just attacked the rook right away, but I want you to pay very close attention to this move, rook to d1. As teachers, we sometimes say it's bringing in the last piece. It looks passive because, you know, it's behind the queen and it doesn't have access. You can't even lift the rook, but it's a little bit deeper than that. If you remember our study of the IQP, this pawn here on d4 will get attacked. It's already being attacked. You can see that the pressure that's being put on the pawn, and also there is this little x-ray of the rook looking at the bishop. So in the event that Big Mama goes, you know, camping up in this area looking to get the king, you have to make sure that if you need to retreat this bishop, you're not locking in this rook in the corner. So it's just grandmaster play. You bring in that last piece, you support something in advance that you know is going to be attacked. Okay? Now the reoccupation of d5. Offering the trade of dark squared bishops. That is something black would love to have happen. If you trade the dark squared bishops, here maybe the knight on c would take back. And if this happens, you know, chess is a game played with 2 colors on the board. Oh boy, that's genius, Mike. How'd you figure that out all by yourself? Yeah, I did. It took a long time. There's black and white squares. If you look at the area near the black king, without the dark squared bishops, you're obviously not going to penetrate as easily as you could if you kept it. Number 2, the light squares are all protected by my pawns. And you'll see that the knights guard each other, meaning if you keep trying to get rid of my outpost here, you're not going to do it. I'm just going to keep replacing it, and your attack will fizzle out, and then we'll get deeper and deeper into the middle game, eventually the end game, where white is going to go purely defensive, which is what happened in our first game, right? Okay, so you don't want to trade dark square bishops here. So what to do? What would you do with the bishop? Of course, bishop h6. Just, you know, let's hit the dark squares, and rook to e8. When I went over this game in my database, there was only 2 games played prior to this. Remember, this is 1971. Now, there could have been more that just weren't published, but I'm assuming at this point both of these players are pretty much on their own. So now they're not thinking like opening prep. Now it's more about playing against the structure that they've probably seen 4 gazillion times. Okay, so rook e8, and now how to play. Very instructive play by Smyslov. He plays on the other side of the board. He plays bishop to a4, which creates an annoying pin on the c6 knight. He gets it away from the rook on c8, and here Karpov plays a6. So you can see with the possibility of pushing forward here, you keep knights and all other pieces away from the b5 square, and then the reason for bishop a4 is kind of revealed. Knight takes knight. Again, another counterintuitive move. What are you doing? You have the isolated queen pawn, yet you're encouraging a trade. You're also bringing the queen to the center of the board and, kind of making a battery towards your king. When I first saw this, I was like, what is he doing? It doesn't make sense to me. But remember, he wants to target the dark squares. The knight is covering some of the dark squares, right? You see that e5 square, very sensitive square when you've played moves like g6. But with the queen there, there's a cool little maneuver now. Queen to e3. Again, notice the connection, all on the dark squares. Bishop to f6, trying to cover up. And now you see the bishop on a4 return to b3, hitting the queen. And this should trigger in your mind the possibility of tactics on this square. I know that doesn't seem possible at this point, but what if the queen goes back to d8? Okay, I'm just, making this up. And then you hop your knight into e5. You see, isn't that thematic? Didn't we talk about that e5 square for the knight? You have players at your level that will think, I don't want to take and force this pawn wedge here on my 5th rank. That seems like I'm giving up too much space. So what if I just cover up the king? And I'll bring my knight over here and guard some of these squares. You guys see a tactic here? Yep, this was in your blog. Black is cooked. Knight takes f7, just absolutely cooked. So if you go back after bishop to b3, you kind of see what's going on in these moves here. All sorts of things can happen. And here in the game, Queen h5 was played, and this is difficult. It's a little bit of a mistake. Okay, stop your video. White to play. d5. d5. That's that thematic push. And after d5, the tactics really start. You cannot take the pawn. It's mate in 2. Chop, chop. Game is finish it, I tell you. Look at that. So d5, very powerful move. The knight is attacked. What do? The knight went back to d8, and I'm going to pick it up a little bit. There are notes to this game where, bishop g5 was thought to be a stronger move, but Smyslov just carries on. After d5, that weak pawn becomes a monster. He plays d6 with the idea, obviously, of forking those 2 rooks. And, rook c5 was played, and the old expression that you'll learn, passed pawns must be pushed. So the pawn pushes forward, attacks the rook comes to e7, and now queen f4. You see where she's heading? Really, really nice chess. Bishop to g7 was played, and that was a decisive blunder. Black had to go in for the move bishop takes f3, and as a human to find all this stuff over the board, it's almost impossible. You would take the bishop here, They would take here, you could take here, and I think white is going to end up in exchange in this line. But Karpov missed it, and it still wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but it was much better than what he did. He played bishop to g7, and now he's lost because Smyslov finds queen to b8, and this pin on the knight is really nasty. So he gives up a piece here, but gets one back here with check. The bishop blocks, and this is a long video, I know, and I'm going to include a computer line here because in the game Smyslov played rook to e3, which is winning. It's a really strong move, but you know, it's so nice to have these these beasts, these computers. Look at this just for a second. How about, would you ever dream of taking that pawn with your rook? It's just like so strong, just a killer move. If you take with the pawn, then they don't even take anything with check, or they just take on b6, and they hit your bishop, they hit your rook, and some sick line like this takes place. Check, rook takes, check, king h8, check. I mean, just let this sit on your board for a minute, and like, oh my God, like who would find these moves? But the computers do. They're just killers. So after rook e3, the game ended up finishing pretty quickly. Karpov just attacks the pawn on d7, and here just simple tactics, just give stuff back, but you're going to win a piece. Queen takes f8, check, and queen took. You just make a new queen, and at this point you have no choice. You know, you take it and you're down a piece. You know, just you can take a look at it. If you just take that off, we just take back check. And if you look at the board, you'll see that white is up a pizza. All right? Okay, Grandmaster. Long video. I hope you enjoyed it. You can watch it in 2 parts, but just keep it, you know, because by the end of this session, you're going to have 7 master games firmly implanted in those brains of yours. Okay, that's the purpose anyway. See you, Ben.